Bari Kekel, welcome everybody. I'm going to provide the introduction here mostly in English. I wanted to welcome everybody to our CV Armenian Center here in La Crescenta. We're very happy to have, if you haven't been here before, definitely a great place to visit. We have a lot of things going on at the center. And one of the things is the event here that you're gathered for, which is put together by our Public Educational Committee here at the center. They've done a great job. Over every month we have a different lecture that gets organized. And today's lecture is going to be by Antranig Kzirian. I was thinking about what I was going to say about Antranig, because I've known him actually for a long time. We're both East Coasters from Washington, D.C., and I reached out to him. I said, hey, I know your bio, but is there anything you want me to say? And it was
only the good stuff.
Yeah, only the good stuff. But what he responded with was, he said, weren't you my counselor on the East Coast at some point? I said, I probably have been. But that was kind of what I wanted to lead into it, because just recently, a month ago, he was a counselor to my kids here up at AYF camp. So I think today's lecture is in the same vein of passing on our tradition and culture and how that gets passed to all of our youth. And what better place than our youth center, the Meher and Satig Ohanessian Youth Center here, to be able to hold an event like this. So I'll read off a little bit more about your bio, Antranig. So I'm not going to embarrass you with anything that I know from our past, but so Antranig is an Armenian American oud performer, composer, educator, and researcher dedicated to preserving and advancing the Armenian American oud tradition. His lecture explores how the oud became a powerful instrument of memory and identity for Armenian communities in the U.S. after the Armenian genocide, carrying cultural heritage through generations of diasporan life. Originally from Philadelphia and now based in Los Angeles area, Antranig blends folk, rock, classical, and jazz influences to reimagine traditional Armenian music and create original compositions. Alongside his artistic work, he's an attorney with degrees from University of Pennsylvania, Villanova, Columbia, and any other ones you want to add on? No?
That's enough.
He's also held leadership roles with the Armenian National Committee here. The Western region, and he served as executive director, chairperson, and secretary. So with a diverse background, I did mention your stint in Visa, which was also the aspect of rock that he was involved in, but we are here and I'm very excited to hear his lecture about the oud and how it ties to our Armenian community.
Thank you to Vahe, Alishan, the committee for organizing this event. When Vahe reached out, I think it's been at least a year, we were trying to schedule something, and finally with the calendar we were able to do it. And what Alishan, you said about different generations, that's very much what this topic is about. It's about generations, it's about survival, it's about adapting, it's about challenges and thriving. It's a story of the human condition. It's not just about this instrument or politics or one specific thing. It's kind of, as we experience in our lives, it's everything blended together. A couple kind of quick things I kind of wanted to start with. So this lecture is based off of a paper I did when I was a graduate student in New York 15 years ago. I had gone to a program for finance because my day job was legal, finance, etc. But since I was very, very young, I had always been very passionate and intrigued and mystified by this piece of wood, assemblage of wood and string, and I always wanted to learn how to play it. And lo and behold, I'm in the course catalog, and I'm flipping through and I'm looking for an elective I can take because I'm only going to be there for 2 years. And I forget what page it was, but there was a course called Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. And I couldn't believe it. I said, this is like a joke. Is someone going to walk in and say this is not a real class? But it was a real class. It was a seminar. Professor Melissa Bilal, who the paper was written for, she's a Bolsa High academic. She was teaching at Columbia, and as the fates would have it, I happened to be there when she was teaching this class. So I go into the class. It's 5 of us. It was me and my roommate, another Armenian, who was also from the West Coast, a Kurd, a Palestinian. This is like a joke, like walking into a bar, right? And a Turk and a Jew. Yeah, it was exactly all those things. So I walk into the class, and I was like, after 10 minutes, I'm like, this is the story of my life, this class. Being a diasporan, descendants of genocide survivors, I'd say a time capsule of having a possession of our memory. It was all laid bare in that class. And it made me reflect on my generational background. And I wanted to ask the group, so how many of the attendees today here are born overseas? Just outside of America. Okay. How many were born here, but their parents are born outside of America? How many were born here, parents were born here, grandparents were born here? Okay. That's kind of what I was expecting. So I'm fourth generation American on my father's side. My great-grandparents came from Sebastia, which is called Sivas now, and from a little village called Tivrik, and also Arapgir and Yozgat. That's my father's lineage. So they came in 1906, and then their son, Mardios, my grandfather, his name is David, you'll see his picture later, he would tell me stories of a man named Karakin Der Harutyunyan, who I don't know if some of you recognize who that is. He came to America to organize the Armenian youth. And my grandfather talked about him because he would go to meetings when he was like a 7, 9, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid with Karakin Nejde. So in my family, we grew up with a very strong affinity for our culture and the presence of Armenians in the United States. And the reason I mention that is because when we're going to talk about this instrument now, it can be very conflicting. The Asia Minor, which is where we ancestrally have lived for time immemorial, there's been a lot of change there, right, as we know, for a long time. And our people kind of felt the sharp edge of that change. But it doesn't change the history of what that instrument and that lineage and that history means. So that's something that I just want to kind of give as a disclaimer before we get into the presentation. So we're going to start with the story. So the story starts, I'd say, in the eastern United States and also Fresno. I just didn't have enough room to type it up there. But think of eastern USA and Fresno. Post-genocide, Armenians are rebuilding in the diaspora. Just like Armenians who have been coming now or recently. Whenever I meet Armenians who were not born here, I think of my great-grandparents. And I say, this is what they went through, the adapting and the challenges. So there were no schools. My grandparents talked about it often. When they were growing up in the 20s, there were no Armenian schools in America, obviously, right? And they would talk about doing bake sales during the Depression, fundraisers, and they would send the money to the camps outside of Aleppo and Beirut to their cousins and siblings. My grandmother, Sarah Yesayan, Arap Gertzi, grew up in Haverhill, Mass. On a farm in the 20s. And she talked about this. She said we would do bake sales. I was on the committee. We would collect the money, and we would get organized with, ARS, God Mikhach, Near East Relief, and we would send the money to the Middle East, to our cousins. So in this setting of no Armenian schools, adapting to a new environment, what do you have? Food, right? Church. You have your community centers, which back then, compatriotic unions we would call it. Sepastati miyutun, Arab gertsi miyutun, Kharpertsi miyutun, and on, Marashti like my mom. And they would have events, picnics. I would hear stories of picnics in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia with 5,000 people at a picnic. Back then, there's no phones, there's no Instagram, there's no TikTok. And they would be getting on the trains with massive bowls of pilav because they missed seeing their friends. And there were no schools, but there was music. Someone said music. Yes, that's a big one. The music's a big one. So the music was their way of connecting. Their way of connecting with home. So as we were just saying, community events. I grew up, they called it bazaar, the American Armenians, or bazar, right? It's a food fair. In the East Coast, every November, you would have the bazaar. Armenian food, home cooking from all the ladies. They would cook subareg, sarma, yalanchi, kebab, everything, homemade. And everyone would circle it on their calendar, and it would be packed. It was a way to preserve your identity. Music, dances, weddings, and house parties. So as the decades are flying by, you have music taking over as the central player. Music is taking that essential central role. And this is a photo of they called it KEF events in the 50s. Some of the people in this picture, I won't get into the names, but they were some of my mentors when I was growing up, the New England musicians. So what is the oud? Can I get a show of hands if you're familiar with the oud? Okay, all right, we're doing good work. It's a good number, it's about half. Not to just read what's up there, there's early records from as early as 5,000 years ago. In the Mesopotamian origin region, which is Iraq and Iran today, showing a stringed instrument, looks like it's plucked, and it was with trade routes spreading all over Asia Minor, the Caucasus, which is our present-day homeland, all over the Middle East, where Armenians were, in high numbers in population for centuries, parts of Europe, Africa. But there was also this kind of personal dimension for me when I was growing up. So this is where it kind of fast forwards to the family side. So when I was a young kid and I was growing up in the AYF in my church, whenever I would go to a community event, if there was a band, and I was, 8 or 9-year-old kid, I would notice the ensemble, the group, because I loved music. But we didn't have music in our family. So I would go and I would see all the musicians and even non-musicians, enthusiasts we can call them. And they would be huddled right at the stage and just watching the band, which I don't see that as much when I moved to California. But when I was a kid, I would wonder, like, well, what are these guys doing? Why is everyone enthralled and so focused on the group? And within that, they were all huddled right on top of the oud player. It was like he was like Elvis or something. Didn't matter who he was. It was typically an older gentleman from anywhere, New England, Fresno, whoever it was. There's countless Armenian oud players. And everyone was watching, studying, focused on, mesmerized by the oud player. And I'm an 8-year-old kid. And it was very striking to me. It's one of my earliest core memories. And I'm also delighted to say that some of my students are here, so I feel a very strong generational pull. So it's great that you're here to hear these things. It's awesome. So the oud that is in this picture was built by an American Armenian. There's a long tradition, over 100 years, of Armenians in the United States building ouds, not just playing them, literally building them in their workshops, like serious craftsmen, serious luthiers. John Merjanyan, who is from my hometown, he has passed away a long time ago, but he was one of the most accomplished and famous of the Armenian oud makers in America. We also have another Armenian oud maker right here in Southern California in Orange County, Biken Najarian. He is a great craftsman. He's also built some of my ouds. The oud that is here on the ground, also built in Philadelphia by Edward Hoplamasian, 92 years old, building ouds still. He's been building them for 50 years. So that's something I just wanted to impress on the audience, that this is not just some new tradition that has started. It's been going on for about a century in America. Okay, so let's kind of get into Armenian life. So as we were saying, music was central. It was a central theme. Whether it was weddings, parties, gatherings at people's homes. And what I was saying about the focus as a sacred instrument. So why was that? That was kind of the lifelong question that I had as a youth. What was happening? Why was everyone so focused on the oud? And because I didn't have music in my family, I kind of embarked on this journey on my own. I was hunting, I was hungry for teaching, I needed to find a teacher. And I remember with my mother asking around in our agum, where there's all, because Philadelphia has a long tradition of many Armenian bands. The Vospigians, the Magrdichians from the Gomidas group, the Arziv band. It's just many, and you'll see a picture later with a flyer from 60 years ago. We finally found me an oud teacher. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Like, I have an oud teacher. I would go to my AYF meeting on Friday night, and I didn't care about anything in the meeting because I knew I was going to have my lesson right afterwards, which was perfectly fine with me at 12 years old with my oud in hand. Because I was starting to figure out that it wasn't just the strings and the sound. Whenever I would hear my grandparents talk about their lives and their parents, whenever I would hear about our history, whether good or upsetting, I started to kind of connect the instrument to the story. And at first when I was young, I didn't quite understand it. But it was always there, kind of like accompanying me, like an angel on my shoulder. Like, we're going to go through this journey together, and the instrument's going to kind of help you figure it out. And in this picture is one of our, I would say, foremost vanguards, Richard Hagopian, who's from Fresno, who has done a phenomenal job in his very long career preserving this music and passing it along in his family as well. So when I was at Columbia and I did this paper, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, I decided to interview musicians and family members who I felt had something to say that hadn't been recorded yet, or something that would help inform the understanding of the impact of the music on the culture. So when I interviewed my grandfather, who's pictured here, he said something to me that was very, very impactful, and also something that was a contradiction to what I would hear from other Armenians. Because many Armenians I would meet from the Middle East, like most of my friends growing up, their parents had come from the Middle East. And they were born here, but their parents were from Baghdad, Aleppo, Beirut, and so on, right? And whenever I would pull out my oud with them, there was two things that would come out. One, you're playing Arabic music, which to me was like, what? I don't understand. Or the second thing, you know where this is going, it's Turkish, right? So those were two very common things that I faced as a youth. But then every once in a while, someone would say, play some Udi Harant, because they knew. So there's hope. But my grandfather would talk, like we were saying earlier, the compatriotic unions, Arap Simiyotun, Marash Simiyotun, the stories of home. But there would be this common thread, again, contradictory. And that's why I wrote these key words here. It was a mix of sadness, strength, survival, and it was all blended in one. And my mother told me when I wasn't around, because my brother's a musician too, and we both wanted to play music and we did. My grandparents never told me this, and this is kind of the next piece of the mystery. My mom would say, Grandpapa and Grandmom want one of you to play the oud when we were little. But they never told me that. And I always wondered why, and now they're both gone, so I haven't had I'll never be able to ask them that. But I always wondered why they never told us directly. And I just thought, okay, maybe they didn't have a chance. But as we get into the rest of the presentation, you'll see the reasoning of why that is. But they were able to tell my parents, who were good messengers. So, as we were saying, genocide has happened, loss of homeland, all the history that everybody knows. Institutions destroyed, music, along with language and food and tradition, is part of rebuilding for the future. So, for me, the oud was very much a symbol of rising from the ashes. And not just symbolically, very literally, because the oud became this eternal flame of sorts for genocide survivors in the eastern United States musically. It was their route to coping with what was lost in the homeland. It was a way to look ahead to the future. And this picture here, I'm sure many of you will know the gentleman who's in a tuxedo-looking outfit with a bow tie is Antranig Kzirian. He's one of the foremost performers and singers and songwriters of this oud-style Armenian tradition. And this is from at least 50 years ago, where he was kind of a dashing young man on stage. But these kinds of events were what really held the community together. This is a picture from 1920, Armenians in Hartford, right after the genocide, just being organized over 100 years ago. It's kind of staggering. Okay, so now we're moving ahead in time here a little bit. So the two musicians here were two of the foremost Armenian oud players in the United States. John Berberian from New York City on the left, and George Mugardishan on the right with the tan sports coat. So why does that matter? As I was saying earlier, many Armenians from the Middle East associated the oud with Arab music, right? And I remember when we first met, it was like, oh, there's this whole Armenian tradition of oud, like what is this, right? So in the eastern United States, the Armenian American musicians were essentially thrust into this open laboratory, experimenting. They were fusing with jazz, rock, classical music, Latin music, all kinds of different, like John Berberian grew up in New York City, near Morningside Heights. A lot of Puerto Rican immigrants were there. When I listen to John, I hear Latin sounds when he plays in his Armenian melodies. The other oud player, George Mugardishan, he went to my church where I grew up, St. Gregory's in Philadelphia. He was a Juilliard student. When I hear him, I hear classical, virtuosic, orchestral kind of playing. It's funny how that works, isn't it? And he was the first Armenian oud player to play with a symphony orchestra 60 years ago. He did it. So these are the kind of the top-in-class guys that really carried the torch. But the important takeaway here is they ushered in a new era of oud playing, where the oud was the featured instrument. The oud played the melodies. The oud played the solos. In Armenian ensembles in Armenia today, the oud does not do those things. The oud plays more of a supportive role, a kind of harmonic, rhythmic role. So, speaking of the generations, and we're going to kind of come to the main event here. And there are some people here tonight who are in this photo. Khoren, you're one of them. Yes. Chris, you as well. So, as part of the generational kind of treasure of passing this music along, we would get together. The different generations would get together. And in this photo, Chris, your father-in-law's in this photo, Satig, Jack Chalikian's in this photo from the old Keftime group from Fresno. John is in this photo. A bunch of musicians from Los Angeles are in this photo. We would get together, all different generations, spanning 70 years, and we would play music together and learn together. And it was a way for us to also cope with the history and pass along the music. And that brings us to Udi Harant. So who is Udi Harant? Udi Harant, I'd like to state that this is kind of my nerdy moment. I shared the earth for 4 days with Udi Harant. He passed away when I was 4 days old. And I always wondered about that because when I would talk to John Barbarian, he'd say, your generation didn't have that connection to the first players. And he's like, it's just the way it was, but there's a missing link. So I always like to think that Harant was in a way kind of spiritually there. And why do I say that? He was the grandfather, the father, again, the vanguard. He was the main oud player that brought Armenian oud playing to America. He was from Turkey, and a lot of his songs are still performed in Turkey today, that he wrote himself, along with many other Armenian composers. But because all the Armenians in America, again, no schools, longing for connection, longing for home, he showed up at the perfect time. He brought the culture that they were famished for. He brought it with his oud and his minstrel, troubadour, bard-like playing, and he was an overnight sensation. He was that Elvis Presley. He did become that, essentially a rock star, bringing that culture back to the Armenians in America who were longing so much for that connection. And thankfully, he had students, some of whom are in this presentation, who helped pass it along. We were very fortunate in our generation to have that now multi-generational connection of teaching. So this is a picture that has always kind of been very special to me. This is a Sebastian Miu tune flyer in Philadelphia with Udi Harant performing in Armenian language, of course, and the Arziv Orchestra talking about how he has arrived and he's going to be performing all these folk songs, and it reminds me of how quickly things over decades change. So that's a very kind of, I'd say, borderline like emotional picture for me.
What year was that?
I would say that's 54, maybe, but I can check on that. That's after it's already been established. It's not some new thing anymore. This is like they're in the heyday. He's been coming for years. So funny thing about Udi Harant, he was blind. He had an illness when he was very young. And part of his visits to America were supported by these music enthusiasts, both Greek and Armenian, who would also do medical research to see if they could cure his blindness, which of course was not successful. But as a byproduct of those trips, he would give massive concerts where he kind of established his brand and his music and became very, very well known and accomplished. So we were talking a little bit earlier about why my grandparents wouldn't tell me directly about wanting me to play the instrument. So in my interviews for this paper, I asked the various musicians from different generations, one of which is Antranig Kzirian. He was just here a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure some of you remember the workshop he gave. So I was very blessed to have him as one of my teachers when I was at Columbia. He helped me learn how to play the oud. And he said, when he was little, his dad was Onik, wouldn't let him go into the room where the oud was. And I said, that's nuts. Like, why is that? I'm like, your father sings, he plays, he loves the music, you're his son. Doesn't it make sense that he's passing this tradition on to you? And he said, if I ever tried to go in there, there would be hell to pay with Dad. And he said it had everything to do with the trauma. Everything. And at first I said, okay, that makes sense. And then I moved on. And in my other interviews, they said the same thing. Different generations from different regions of the United States were all saying the same thing. They weren't allowed to go into the room to get the instrument, and they would sneak in when they could, and then they kind of earned the right to play it. But there was a very strong barrier to entry in the beginning. So the trauma was definitely a real part of it. And I feel like the quotes that I have from my grandfather and what Ara said kind of explain it. And it's a little contradictory, but he says this very similar thing. The oud is the standard. For an Armenian American, you as in himself, cannot conceive of this music without it. This is from an American Armenian saying this, of course. That forbidden fruit that was the perfect custodian. So why was it protected? We were just saying, forbidden to children. Some said it was fear of disrespecting the instrument. The one person I interviewed from my generation, he's a little older than me, he's 50 now. He's the grandson the grandnephew of the man who built this oud. He said, he's a violinist, he told me that they didn't want him to play the oud in the beginning because chavlaja, if you know what that means. The negative connotation of playing the instrument in like a cabaret setting, out late. He said that lifestyle was something that they didn't want for their kids as well. But he said when he would dig in deeper, and there's an interesting story about that, the real truth would come out. So it's later in the slides, but I'm going to say it now because it's the appropriate time. So there's a song in Turkish called Çanakkale İçinde, right? It's about the Battle of Gallipoli. The Turks sing it as a patriotic song. The battle was in February of 1915. It was before the orders, right, in April. It was, I think, the last major battle where Armenians were conscripts and actually part of the Ottoman army before they were changed in status from the genocide era. In my research, this person said, when I was a kid, the musicians would argue on stage about should they play that song or not. And not because they wanted to play it to be cool, but because the song had a very deep, wounding meaning for them, and also a sense of healing. And in my research, I found that there's a Greek patriotic singer who sings that song, right? I see the heads nodding. And Armenians recorded that song too, but they weren't released in Turkey, which makes sense, because it would be taboo. So that song, Armenian orphans changed the lyrics of that song, from what I found, to talk about their loss and their experience. And the oud players in America who descended from those orphans knew that song as a song that their parents would sing about home. Turkish language, of course. So when I say contradictory and trauma, it's all, I think that kind of lays bare a lot of what's intertwined here. And as you can see here, this is John Berberian from a previous photo. He's 86 now. This is him as a youth playing the violin. His father, Yervant, who was a terzag and would repair ouds in his shop in New York in the 20s. So as I was saying, certain songs carried trauma, they carried memory. This is when I was visiting with Richard, maybe right before COVID, pretty recently. And we talked about all of these things. And he told me a very interesting story as well. I'm sure everyone knows who that is. Solomon Terlidian, of course, Erzincan. So the story goes like this. It's, I believe, around 1950, and Terlidian is now in the twilight of his years. He's relocated to the West Coast, and there is a banquet in honor of him in Fresno. And Mr. Hagopian is just a kid, 13 or 14. He's now, of course, an elderly oud player. And he said, when I was a kid, he said, I used to help at the church halls and help with the food, and then if they needed music, he's like, I do it. It reminds me of when I was in Aravod. We would serve the food to the community event, and then we would play on the stage as well. He did the same thing. And he said, they said, Mr. Terlidian wants to talk to you. And he, knowing that he grew up playing both Turkish and Armenian music from Asia Minor, he said, I was very scared. He's like, I don't know, what does this guy want with me? He's like, he's a hero. I play the oud. Is he going to yell at me? He's like, I don't know what's going to happen. So he said, Terlidian sits down with him, and says, I hear you play the oud, bring it. And he said, okay. So he goes to his car, he gets his oud, and he said, what do you want me to play? Because he's like, I'm playing some taksims, he's like, I'm nervous, I don't know what to do. And Kzirian says, play Çanakkale içinde to him. And he couldn't believe it, of course. And he said, Pais Baron Kzirian daç gelene. He said, and I have the quote here, I told you to play the song, so play it. So that's not to say that it's good or bad to play that song. It's to show the complexity of the history, the rawness of the wounds and the healing, and how the oud and the music was very much a part of that tortured reality. But there's also a message of hope after all these generations. And the grandnephew I was just talking about is in this picture with his violin. This is at the AYF Olympics, recent picture. There is a young Alishan, that's your brother-in-law as well. So when we grew up with all these pressures, don't play that instrument, what are you doing? And then we would have to educate. Why is it this way? What is it? So the breaking taboo was a huge part of this music. And my theory is, we didn't want it to be lost. We lost so much. Think of all the contributions that were made in Asia Minor that were either taken away from us or for stigmatized, fear-based, but understandable trauma-based reasons, Armenians abdicated or renounced these things. Like the Balia architecture, Balians, all of the contributions from that era. How many Armenians even know about what was in that era? That they still play Armenian music in Turkey 100 years later. So maybe because we were proud, or we wanted a sense of purpose as young musicians, we said, no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to do that. We're going to preserve it. And not only are we going to preserve it, but we're going to breathe new life into it. As youth, we're going to play these songs. We're going to take it into the future. So we didn't want the folk music to be obfuscated. We didn't want it to be trivialized. We didn't want it to be marginalized. Who cares if it was old or Turkish? How old is the dolma that you've been eating recipe? Pretty old. Still pretty good though, right? It's like funny, but also not funny. Okay. And a big part of what our work was to pass it along generationally. And I'm very blessed. I've been fortunate to have the most incredible teachers, mentors that I've been able to study with, learn from, do concerts with alongside, talk to, visit with. This is just a recent example of one of those events, how this is all a part of our memory and our identity. And as Ara, who was, I think, my youngest teacher, and this is one of my favorite quotes, without our music, we are not Armenian. So I will kind of cut it at this point because I do want to give people a chance to have questions, but these are essentially the conclusions of my research. The oud has been a critical part of our history. It was imbued with the dynamics of survivor, the struggles of survivors. All of these elements were intertwined. It was a reminder of home, but it was also a healing agent. And for that reason, very important. And also critically, we must go into the future with the instrument. So you look back to the generations behind you, but you also reach forward, pass this tradition along to the next generation, right, Sato? And we're telling our story, right? We're Armenians, and we've survived and thrived, and we should tell our story. And as you can see here, Onik is a huge part of that as well with his inspiration. So I have a map here with many of the lost areas of Western Armenia. And I'll ask the organizers, I was going to play some music from each of these regions just very briefly, or we could do questions and do that after. Music first? Okay. You heard enough from me already? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to do a little tour. And you don't have to leave your seat. No flights, no tickets, no hotels. Okay, so I'm biased because I'm Sepastati, so the first stop is Sepastia. And we're going to do a brief sample of the Sepobar. I'm being told to come to the middle. As you might guess, these songs also each have their own dance steps, but I'm not that good of a dancer. So, all right, so that's Sepastia. The next one, we will stop in Malatia. Thank you. So that's a tamzara, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. There's about 100 different ones. That is one of the tamzaras from the Malatia region. Where I was growing up in Philadelphia, there were, I would say, dozens of Malatiati families. So that was a song that kind of got drilled in a little bit. Next is Arapgir, which is my paternal grandmother's ancestral region. And next we will go to Mush. So one thing I'll say, there were not many families from Mush when we were growing up. It was a lot of the villages and regions I'm mentioning, Sepastia, Malatia, Harpert, Arapgir. But as I kind of came into my own older as a musician and a student, I started to meet musicians who were playing Mushesi music. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Mushesi Khur, right? That folk line dancing, like a pampuri. There are certain singers that kind of specialize in that music. It's very zurna based. So something like this. to Antranig Kzirian. Are there any Antranig Kzirians here? Okay, very good. Perfect combo. We could keep going. So as you go through this map, and that was one of the, I'd say, one of the very rewarding things of playing and learning this music. When I was young, I would hear these melodies, and I was blessed to have somewhat of an ear so I could study them and learn them with my teachers and peers. But I remember meeting dance instructors out here in Los Angeles, and I would say to them, I know these songs, but I don't know where they're from, some of them, or I don't know what they're called. One of them was Tom Bozigian, so he's kind of helped with that. But we have such a rich history here of song and dance, and some of it is preserved and remembered, which is a great thing, but much of it is still not. So one of the things that's important to me is to try and raise awareness of this music, of this story, of this instrument and its special place in our generations, in our families, in our hearth, and to share it with you. So now it's something that you've heard about, and you might remember when you're talking to someone about Armenian music. So I'll close with that, and then I'll leave it to the organizers for questions or however you'd like to do it.
Thank you, Antranig. Amazing lecture, and yeah, I think it's if there's any questions. Yeah, we have some questions in the front here. I'll let you go ahead and handle the questions.
Sure. I really am interested in hearing the song about the Battle of Gallipoli.
So you mean about it?
Hearing it.
Oh, you want to hear it?
I want to hear
Okay.
it. I asked for it. What did he say?
Well, I not the lyrics, but I can play it for you.
Okay.
It's actually similar. The mode is similar to the Sebastiabar, which shows how a lot of those songs and that music kind of came from the same place. And the oud player that the story was about there, his name was Ohanessian. He was one of the 5 disciples of Ohanessian, and the story was about him. They were telling him not to play it, and he had very strong feelings about playing it. And he was a very kind of fiery personality, so they played it, is how I heard the story went.
It does sound like the Armenian music.
Yeah.
My question is more artistic, from an artistic perspective. What recommendation do you give to build your identity as an oud player and an artist in general? And have you reached that identity? You understand my question?
Yeah, I think so. It's a good question. Haig's a very talented musician, plays multiple instruments. So I feel like each person has their own journey, each artist has their own journey, and the most important thing that I would say, kind of looking at it from a musician's artistic perspective, like you're saying, is to be true to what your sense of self, your honest sense of self is about your art, to make sure you stay true to that. And that can involve questioning yourself about your music or your songs or things that you compose. But and I would say it's okay to challenge yourself and push yourself. Because I feel like a lot of our best, especially in the Armenians, we have so many incredible composers, which I didn't even get to talk about them, but that's another part that's forgotten. I think you have to raise the bar, raise the standard. Don't be afraid to challenge and push yourself and fall down, but pick yourself up again. But be true to yourself, I would say.
Antranig, a quick question. Thank you for the presentation. My question is about the strength of the origins of the oud and its experience on the East Coast, and how it fared or didn't fare with newer music as it came into our community, and you would go to events and the oud would sometimes recede, and you'd have like keyboards, guitars, and did the oud like fall out of favor, and are we now going to have like an oud renaissance where it's going to regain its rightful place in our community?
That's a great question, and I've struggled with that whole dynamic since I was a youth, because I saw it happening in real time as a kid. So, and Chris, your father-in-law, wrote about this in his book, about the change from the Middle East, and so there's a lot of identity politics that go into that, right? And it's related to what we talked about tonight with the trauma, the taboo. So, because it was old and or Turkish in the views of some, there was a massive pivot away from the music of Asia Minor in the 60s in Lebanon, and which was essentially kind of like the center of Armenian culture, right, in the diaspora, and rightfully so, it was in a way, along with the East Coast. So for those kind of political, social, identity construct-based reasons, there was a very strong move into that world. So then, what are your instruments now? Synthesizers, right? Because it was the trend. And music is like that, even today. Every month or every year, there's a new trend in music, right? The trends back then were that like disco, rock, pop, whatever those blends of sounds were. And there were many talented musicians from that era, like Paul Baghdadlian. I mean, we grew up listening to him too, and Haru Pambukjan. There's a whole host of them. But their sound was that sound, right? It wasn't this folky sound. And it wasn't that, it was duduks or zurnas or ouds. It went into a modernish sound of drums, keyboards, guitars, even brass like saxophones and trumpets. But it was derived from a political decision to change the sound because that other sound is either primitive or Turkish, or both. And it was very real, and it did happen. So on the East Coast, of course, in the 70s, the immigrant wave started from the Middle East, right? So in real time, as I was saying earlier, I saw that music come in with the families of all of my friends, my classmates at my Armenian school, my AYF peers, when I was serving on the altar at the church. More than half the kids, their parents were from overseas. So the oud was like the American Armenian instrument, and the other music was the other music for if you were not an American Armenian. But over time, it's interesting, time heals, right? So there was conflict about that, but from what I've seen, if anything, it's kind of melded and fused and come together, both culturally and musically. And I think that's a beautiful thing because that's what we should be doing. Kind of uniting, I mean, Lord knows we need more of that. Uniting and bringing it together, and especially in music. But I'm sure, so if you've noticed it, I'm sure it's something that people think about. Yeah, actually, you have a question, right?
Yes. I'm from Lebanon, and my parents are from Gilia, and when I was a kid growing there and hearing music and all that, this instrument was practically absent from there.
Which one?
The oud.
The oud.
Yeah, practically absent. Do you?
What was the instrument? I'm intrigued. What was the instrumentation that they used?
They have the kamancha and the tar and that mostly. Sometimes the old generation, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, this instrument was not part of the tradition that we used to go to, Yakantes or Barantes or whatever, to hear those. Do you have any explanation for that?
Yeah, it's related directly to what we were
Yeah,
just talking about.
Yeah.
That is
somehow.
that is the answer.
Yeah.
Because so there's some history there, right? So when you think of the village, like the most basic human condition, the instruments from the village, zurna,
Yeah.
right? As a wind instrument. Davul, which is just skin and wood, because you need a percussion to dance, right? Because remember, they're going to dance. If they're harvesting or a wedding or just hanging out with the neighbors, they're dancing. It's a folk life, right? In the village life. And then for the string instruments, in the village, they didn't have the tools or the wealth to build these. So there was no ouds. The oud was essentially had become over time an instrument of the court. I'm talking about the Ottoman period. It was an elevated instrument. That's not a secret, 100%. In the villages, saz, kamancha. And the thing that has to be said, it wasn't only Armenians playing those instruments. Because when we think, okay, the davul zurna, right? We say, like for a wedding or a whatever the event is, let's get davul zurna. But I have news for everybody. Even back then, and Ara talks about it too, about the music and the land. Guess what? Davul zurna, everybody plays davul zurna, not just Armenians. So it kind of goes both ways. It wasn't just in the same way, it wasn't only Armenians playing the oud. Just like not only Americans play the guitar. I mean, and we can go on and on. That's why I try to cover these topics, to touch on these things, to disconnect the political dimension from human history and musical things that happen because of trade and time and neighboring dynamics.
Yeah, because we thought that this maybe they used to play in Egypt or something of that sort.
Yeah, in the beginning I noted that. Like when Armenians from the Middle East would encounter me or my band and my music, they would say, "Why are you playing Arabic music?" And I was, or Turkish, right? The Turkish one I would kind of be like, okay, they have this idea, and I understand how they came to that idea. But the Arab one for me, growing up here, was very novel. But then I'm like, as I grow up, I'm like, well, obviously, there's a billion Arabs and they use the oud.
Yeah.
Oh, obviously. Yeah, but it's part of our experience as Armenians. But here's the thing, there are Armenians, like just when I was driving here, I was listening to someone named Adam Dikran. Have you heard of him?
No.
Okay, I see some heads, and with my students it comes up. He's Armenian, Dikran Agertsi, family, born in Kamishla, and then in Aleppo. He is the most famous Kurdish folk singer, but he's Armenian. And Haya Hossein, not just, he doesn't know. He moved to Armenia, he lived in Armenia for 20 years. He's an Armenian. And he has songs that he sings in Armenian. And he plays a jumbush. So when he sings that song, is it Armenian music? I don't know. And there's no right answer. But he's an Armenian, singing in Armenian. Who are we to say no? So, Susie, you have, yeah.
I have a quick question. What role do you think the oud has played in preserving the microtones in Armenian music?
Great question. A big one, I'd say. And this kind of allows for that composer question to get a little bit of light. So in the Ottoman era, there were maybe 50 or so very renowned Armenian composers. Some of them I would even compare to like a Mozart or Beethoven level of accomplishment. But, okay, so Kemani Tatios Ekserjan. Does that name, is it familiar to anyone? Raise your hand if it is. Well, it's better than I expected. So these composers, they were Armenians, very accomplished. Their songs are still recorded, played all over the Middle East today. They composed in these modes that you're referring to, which sounds like you would say out of tune, right? And the Arabs use quarter tone music as well. So the ensembles for which they composed used the oud, because the oud was, again, court music. But that was back then. There's nothing like that now. The oud is just like the guitar in the Middle East. Everyone plays it. But I'd say for Armenians, the oud has been really important because it allows those old traditions to continue. Because we didn't even touch on Gomidas here. And there's a big Gomidas dynamic because he changed the music. He preserved it, but he also changed it too. And the oud microtonality is kind of not very compatible with that. So, great question.
I want to argue and say about the Lebanese-Armenian debate. Also, when in Bush Hamoud, when they made the laws that, okay, you guys can't speak Turkish anymore, so that also had an effect on the music, because a lot of there were a lot of oud players, and they preserved them. Because of that rule, they couldn't sing in Turkish.
I know.
Not just
Or even play the instrument. Because it's funny, so with my mother, which now I'm talking about my mother's side, Marashi from Aleppo, she came to America. So my father, it was very common for American Armenians, before, like we were saying, there were no schools. It was common for American Armenian youth from the prelacy or the ARF world to go to Gemaran, we talked about this, Vahe, to learn Armenian in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. My dad was part of that. Hundreds of Armenians went to Gemaran to learn Armenian over decades. He met my mother, who was from Aleppo, in Beirut. He was at Gemaran. He was at Gemaran, but back then, before the Civil War, different time. So she came to America because they met. That's why I exist, which is great. So shout out to my parents. But when she came, she said she went to one of the dances in the 70s, and she had just come from Syria. And she saw this world that I'm talking about. Like Ahmedi guys playing the oud, big dances. She's like, what is this? This is like, what's going on here? And she said this, like she would see Onik and these other oud players singing these old songs. And she said, I know these songs. My grandparents would sing it at the table after dinner. They would sing like Dari Lolo and these other songs that even the Turks have lyrics, the Armenians have lyrics. And she said it was the most incredible thing for her to see that, because when she was growing up in Aleppo and then Beirut, she was there for what you're referencing, which was that major switch, the pivot. But then she stepped into like a time capsule here, and she thought it was very interesting. She still talks about it.
Speaking of Marash, would you mind playing something from Marash or Zaytun? If there is any?
There's, okay, let me think about that. We could do Zaytun. Close. See, we have common language. It just took a minute. Yes.
Antranig, I think this is one of the best and most fascinating lectures in translation.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm glad you found it informative.
I think the reason for me is that you explained the things that we've taken for granted, the music and the wood specifically, to which we've danced, to which we've cried, to which we've laughed, and all that. So it's more than music. And you gave a real good explanation of that history. You gave texture and made it tangible. Two questions.
Please.
So a lot was preserved, and it was probably music was the most successful survivor of the Armenian genocide because it wasn't destroyed and didn't stay, it wasn't buried in Western Armenia, and it came across boats and ships and airplanes to the East Coast and elsewhere. All that's been preserved. Is there any idea or inkling what was lost in terms of that music? Are there any traces? Because you have to think, after all these thousands, you said that oud goes back 5,000 years, and this is a great treasure that we've been able to preserve. But is there any idea of maybe what also we lost? And that's number one. And real quickly, too, it'd be a shame, it'd be a crying shame that this isn't continued institutionally. You're teaching, and you have a dozen or more students here. Have we tried to go into the Armenian schools? And, 2 weeks ago or a week ago, we went to the ARS 135th, and they had sonata, dance, and musical, and they had a lineup of a drum corps. They had the Dalbridge back, very impressive, like 20 Dalbridge. I'm just imagining, fantasizing about having like 20 flute players there next time, or 10 years in 20 or so. What we lost, and can we go ahead and institute?
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Armin. So what was lost? Oh, yeah, I mean, there's no way to know, but it's colossal. It has to be. So much. That's why folks like Ada and others who have preserved, and Richard, that they preserved their recordings that will be, or already have started to be donated or contributed to different university collections and the National Library of Congress. There are preservation efforts to make sure that vinyl and LPs and those old recordings are preserved. And that's kind of part of what you're asking. It's not the whole thing, of course. But to me, that's also very important to mention because there was a mention of Gomidas earlier. There's recordings of a lot of songs that Gomidas notated, but as many would kind of rely on him as like the monolith of sorts of Armenian music derived from Gomidas. He didn't account for certain things that the Western Armenian folk tradition had as staples, which is irreconcilable. There's no evidence to show that it wasn't Armenian. Like he excluded a lot of music, and the preservation was amazing and necessary, and thank God that he did it. But he left out some things in those recordings. So those weren't lost, which is a start. And whether that begs the question of contradicting Gomidas' findings and teachings, I don't care. Like, there are Armenians singing those songs. They're in a 10/8 meter, which is a very Western Armenian ancestral dance rhythm. So that's kind of as much as I can give you on number one, because it's immeasurable what was lost, just like the human loss, right? The second question on the oud, right? So yeah, when you see, of course, we're saying Davul and Zurna, we lost institutions too. So as part of the diaspora experience, the legitimacy of institutions were not really part of the diaspora reality. They're not part of the diaspora reality. We have our institutions as a community, but they're not government, right? It's not like a state. It's not the power and force of a state to add credibility, standardization, consistency, all the things that you need. Like the Soviets did that with their social engineering, right? Armenia was one example of that. They created ensembles, new folk ensembles, all dressed the same, instruments from different regions all sitting together playing. It was all artificial, but it was part of their experiment. The oud has kind of been left out of that, but another encouraging thing I can share is after I had moved here, I don't know if it was because there aren't many oud players here who do this tradition. As I started to become active, whether teaching or performing or whatever the case might be, over time, folks reached out from UCLA. And it was like, we've been missing this pillar for a long time. We have everything else. We have the duduks, and we have the this and the that, and the kamancha. We have it. The tad, right? We have, because they had the force of institutional legitimacy from the state. Whereas the oud, for obvious reasons, some of which we tried to touch on here, did not. Trauma, loss, dispossession, renunciation, identity politics, all those things changed the tenor of the ouds, no pun intended, except being accepted. But thanks to those forefathers, Udi Harant, his disciples, which I went through their names, there was an Armenian, and this is, I didn't mention this yet, and I'm glad you asked. There was an Armenian school, and I wrote about this in my paper. There was and is an Armenian school of oud playing, and it's a darn good one. And it's worth saving and worth taking into the future. And it is what you're asking. So then it becomes a question of scale and resources and school, having it involved in curriculum. But having it included in UCLA alongside the other instruments, I think is a huge step for validation of the instrument. So I'm proud to say the last 3 years I've been teaching it. And it's great. I hope it continues long after me, with many of the talented young musicians who are learning today. That's what I can say.
In present Armenia, do they have the oud?
Yes, they do. And it's funny what happened in the US where, like I said, that experimental laboratory where the oud was allowed to spread its wings and thrive and innovate. In Armenia, with the Soviet example, it did not. Because think of it this way, this is my theory. The Armenians who came to America, it was a very unique experiment. The oud thrived. Open, no limits, no shackles, no rules. But not all the survivors from the genocide or refugees went to Eastern US or Fresno. They went to the Middle East. A lot of them went to Armenia, right? Look at the street names and the cities in Armenia. It's basically Western Armenian, nor this, nor that, everything, right? So, in Armenia, the oud was included in the ensembles, but not in that featured way. It was in the back. And it played the bass, or the rhythm. It didn't play the melody. So it was like a status demotion. And I think I know why. Because they came from Western Armenia, right? So if you're doing identity politics, keep it, But over the last 100 years, I see on social media, there's so much talent in Armenia, and there's many young oud players, both male and female. Before, it used to be a lot of only females who play. I never understood that. But now I see tons of Armenian oud players, and they're not just playing the bass. They're expressing themselves artistically. They're not inhibited, or the stigma of washing it down is not there as much. At least that's what it looks like, and I think that's beautiful. That's a great thing. Because they should be able to play and thrive freely. Check? Yeah. You had a question.
Do you think that there's a big difference between playing the oud and playing the guitar?
I'm uniquely positioned to answer that because my first instrument was the guitar. It was my first love, but then my eyes wandered to the oud. So I've done both. There's a lot of similarities. Are you interested? Are you playing?
I play the guitar right now.
Okay, so I started the guitar when I was 8, and it's fretted, right?
Yes.
Like a piano, like increments. The oud, you don't have that. It's like a violin.
That's the first thing I noticed when I looked at it.
There you go, smart guy. So it's fretless, and so you're responsible for the pitch, which is not easy. But it teaches you how to find the pitch and find your voice too. And it's plucked. So it's plucked like a guitar, fretless like a violin. So, but how old are you?
13.
Okay, well, keep the journey going. Very good. Yes?
Also, I want to express my gratitude, not because you're just preserving authentic Armenian culture, but also you're preserving, in a way, being the closest thing to human spirituality, because the oud is is not just for music. It's also, there's this nuance of it's like meditative, the microtonalities since ancient Egyptian times. So thank you for that.
And I'd say, so here's an interesting thing to mention on that. So the Seljuk Turks invaded Asia Minor in the 11th century, 10th century, right? There's records of the Armenian church using the microtones, the modes. I, pen, kim, ta, there's all the tax, the modulations, 300 years before the Turks arrived in Asia Minor. Which is why it's funny to me when someone tells me it sounds Turkish. Because their own ethnomusicologists and historians acknowledge, Turkish ones, that their ancestral music is from Central Asia. And they were conquerors, right? That's the history. So they, of course, as happens in history, integrated, blended, and they started using the music of the Armenians and the Greeks and the Laz and the this and the that were already there. So that's, if there's one thing I would want you to remember from tonight, aside from all the other nice little things, that's a big one. We were there for a long time.
Antranig, thank you. I have a question for you here to close out, and I have a request, actually. We started out the lecture today recognizing that we're at the Maher and Satig Ohanessian Youth Center, and I was really happy to see a lot of youth here today. A lot of 8, 10, 13 teenagers. What would be the one thing that you would say for our youth that age that is interested in picking up the oud or any other Armenian instrument that really kind of hooked you in and essentially propelled you into where the study that you've been able to conduct for the instrument. And then I'll follow that up. We can close out the night afterwards. I think there's a request for Deleyama. Sure. If we can do that as well. Sure. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. My advice would be find your voice. It doesn't have to be this instrument. Whatever your voice is that you're drawn to. And it kind of goes along what you were asking before, Haig, about being true to your, expressing yourself. What's your spiritual musical voice? Explore as youth, find what works for you and makes you happy, what makes you passionate, what makes you excited to perform or to pick up the instrument. That's the real spark that you should be looking for. And once you find that, then I think the rest you'll figure out. And Deleyama? That's the last one? You sure? Okay, we'll do Deleyama, and then for Udiharant, we'll do Sinanavci.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Yeah. Amazing night, Antranig. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. Thank you for an amazing lecture. I think it's everybody had. I think we could have probably gone all night with questions if we wanted to tonight. But one thing I want to also again thank the organizing committee here. I'll definitely plug here. If you are interested actually in seeing tonight's lecture again, it will be on YouTube if I'm not mistaken, right? CV Armenian Education Committee. So if you look it up on YouTube, it will be so you can see all the music again. Yeah, definitely. So we'll do a group photo as well. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us tonight.